Hello, welcome to Global Business. I am Imewere Uyomokai. First, I must congratulate Nigerians for the signing of the Deep Offshore and Inland Basin Production Sharing Contract Act by President Muhammadu Buhari right there in London where he's holidaying. Of course, there was the politics to the whole thing about the chief of staff coming with a retinue of staff all the way to London just for President Buhari to sign that bill. And it brings to question, did President Buhari hand over to Vice President Oshibajo before he traveled out of the country? Well, that's a question for another day. We say congratulations to Nigerians because this bill means that there is more money in Nigeria's pockets. But not everybody thinks that President Buhari has done the right thing. Some say he's not taking into considerations the needs and wants of Niger Deltans, whom this bill will actually affect. So we've been taking a look at what one person said. Actually, we had a conversation with him, so you'll be hearing his audio, but you'll see his face, of course. Bonstein Osakwe is Executive Director for Foundation for Good Governance and Social Justice. He had his own view on what exactly this bill means to Nigerians. Let's take a listen.
There's need to observe it once again that in spite of the arguments that civil society and community people have made in support of giving more proprietary rights to communities who are the custodian of this nature's blessing, this government in its latest act of signing the PSA Act has again poo-pooed our position and instead is vesting more powers in the federal government. It is ironical, indeed paradoxical at the same time, that while we are asking for deregulation, while we are asking for decentralization, more powers are being vested in the Leviathan known as the federal government. Yes, this will further push the various communities back to the drawing board on how to wrest power for themselves. The control of oil resources in the host communities is going to intensify in terms of the struggle for possession and ownership. Not only that, there's going to be a resurgence of the struggle for resource control and fiscal deregulation. We condemn it in all ramifications. The government may have had power to do what it did, but it does not in any way benefit Nigerians and indeed the mass majority of the people living in the Niger Delta. We are particularly pained in the Niger Delta because the oil doom, which we now prefer to call it because it's no longer a boom, has only brought diseases, deprivation to our people. We live in midst of water, but we cannot get a cup of clean water to drink. When you visit a place like Abuja, as we are now, you will now understand the enormity of the disservice and the gross mishap that the rest of this nation has heaped on the Niger Delta. Let me remind those who seem to be enjoying this situation that Victor Hugo was the one who observed that no arm, no ammunition, no forces on earth can withstand the strength of an idea whose time has come. The struggle has only just begun. We will not give up because there is no retreat, no surrender.
Well, that was Bonstein Osakwe, who is the Executive Director of Foundation for Good Governance and Social Change. That's his own view. For President Muhammadu Buhari, this is a landmark for Nigeria, as he said in a tweet that history has been made. President Buhari said, for the first time under our amended law, 200 million Nigerians will start to receive a fair return on the surfeit of resources of our lands. Increased income will allow for new hospitals, schools, infrastructure, and jobs. According to the president, Nigeria will now receive its fair, rightful, and equitable share of income from our natural resources for the first time since 2003. all attempts to amend the law on the distribution of income have failed. Until today, a combination of complicity by Nigerian politicians and feet dragging by oil companies has for more than a quarter century conspired to keep all taxes to the barest minimum. Okay, so that's what President Muhammadu Buhari thinks. But what do you think? Next week, we shall be exploring deep into the Petroleum Sharing Act that was signed. That's the Petroleum Sharing Contract Act that was signed by President Muhammadu Buhari. A community of about 8 to 10,000 people.
As you see, the water when there, if you drink out from under the pot.
Even if on another place you went to, you cannot even enter there. Every day erosion, every day erosion.
Our right is not even being given to us.
The needful they're supposed to do for us as a community is not done.
Now to other matters. PTP, what does it mean? Privatization through philantropication. What does philantropication mean? Well, there's an anti-corruption scholar, Aaron Bonstein, an American scholar, who thinks that Nigeria can manage stolen assets through philantropication. And we had a talk with Aaron Bonstein as he came to sell the idea to Nigeria. Aaron Bonstein, thank you for joining us on Global Business Talking Point. Now, let's look at the issue of what you have brought into Nigeria, the PTP, philantropication through privatization. Tell us about it.
So the idea that we are talking about here is finding sources of funds that we can identify in Nigeria that could be used or mobilized to start a charitable foundation. And all around the world, there have been foundations that have emerged from things like privatization or using different kinds of assets, using different things like buildings or airports or even the auctioning of rights for cell phone rights, for mobile rights. It also has to do with mining or extractive industries, anywhere there's a possibility of money coming from some source that could be channeled, at least a portion of that money could be channeled into an endowment, into a bank account, which would be managed. And this managed bank account would earn some interest in money, and the bank account capital would stay more or less the same or grow based upon the investments being made. But development programming, social programming, could be funded for the long term based upon these mechanisms, these accounts, and the setting up of foundations. So what we're here to do is promote the idea that in Nigeria, we can look around, see what's available, see what resources could be turned into a foundation, and then talk to all different kinds of stakeholders, like the government. Today we were talking to civil society organizations and others, donors who are coming in the room to promote this idea. We would like that, let's say, in the next 12 months, to figure out our action steps to identify these resources, to have conversations, further conversations with government, etc., and to set up a way, a roadmap to, let's say, in 1 year, in 12 months, or in 2 years, to actually create one of these foundations. So that's the main idea of my trip here today.
You talked about the fact that you have practiced this philantropication through privatization, the PTP, in Kazakhstan. Tell us about your role there and what was the response? How did it all go?
Yes, so the Kazakhstan experience was one where we had $115 million that came from a Swiss bank account that was frozen because the money in that account were bribes that came from US oil companies to the president and prime minister of Kazakhstan at the time to secure drilling contracts in the Caspian Sea, which has some of the biggest oil reserves in the world. And these bribes were discovered. There was an American who was the intermediary between the oil companies and the government. He was arrested and prosecuted. But the question was what to do with these funds, what to do with $120 million. And so a foundation was set up that ultimately benefited more than 200,000 people, very poor, youth, women. That was our main target. And ultimately, we improved how social services were delivered in the country. And we were able to give out grants, we were able to give out scholarships. And like in this country, where a lot of the social investment distribution is done through a conditional cash transfer program, we also had a very big conditional cash transfer program there as well. So that experience taught me a lot. It taught me that you can take something like bad money and make it good and do something very positive with it. In this PTP conversation, that could be one way we could capitalize our foundation. But there may be other ways, there may be other sources of funds. We could talk about, again, if we're talking about extractives, if we're talking about mining or oil and so on, we can talk about, let's just set aside 1%, 10%, 5% of the deal to create an endowment. And sometimes these are millions and millions of dollars that we're talking about. In some countries, there are court cases that result in a penalty against the company. I understand that, for example, in 2018, MTM had this huge fine against it for fraudulent SIM cards or something like that. It was in the millions and trillions, I think, in Naira. And if we had some percentage of that to do investing in a foundation and an endowment, we could make a lot of change. So instead of having money that isn't doing good or that it's just disappearing somehow, we want to be able to identify these kinds of money and create a foundation that could be used to help Nigeria and poor Nigerians with their health, with their education, whatever the priorities are that the communities think, that the government thinks, and so on.
You see, in Nigeria, we don't have very many foundations, very many nationally impactful foundations, just a few like the MTN Foundation or the Dangote Foundation. And that's because there is the issue of integrity. So you're going to bring, you're asking government to set up a foundation or an independent body to set up a foundation, but there'll be the integrity challenge. How did you tackle it in Kazakhstan, and how do you think they should tackle it in Nigeria?
Yeah, so you put your finger on a very important point. This question of governance, this question of avoiding conflict of interest, and the way that we were able to do it in Kazakhstan anyway, when the foundation that I ran there, is that we had an independent board, and none of the organizations represented on the board could benefit from the funds that were being distributed. They could help us program or decide how to program these funds, but they weren't applying for these funds themselves. So I think
they didn't have family members or cohorts.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, every employee had to go through a conflict of interest check, making sure that A, they didn't have people working in the foundation already, B, that they weren't related to the government, C, that they had no criminal issues surrounding them, and so on. But beyond that, we had a series of controls to make sure that our money was used accountably and transparently, and that we were very public about this as well. The way that we used our money, we published in annual reports, we put this information on our website. You could get our annual audit if you wanted to look at it. So everything was very transparent and above board, and I would suggest that any foundation that's created as a result of the process I'm talking about would have to have that kind of management and controls on it.
And finally, you've met with government or government representatives. Who are those you met with, and what was the response like?
Well, the response has been interesting, meaning they're interested, but the case hasn't been built for them in a convincing enough way yet. And I think that that's, of course, because we just got here, we're just sharing these ideas. I think they're learning from international experience. They're understanding what the benefit would be for them in terms of having a foundation that could help them solve social issues. I think they would be very interested. And so far, we've just talked to a very small percentage of the government. We talked to the Ministry of Justice yesterday. Frankly, they weren't very happy about the idea of taking like a bacheloot and turning it into a foundation, even though I think that would be a wonderful idea. But they did say if we could help with recovering assets, we could get more or less a portion of those assets back to do this kind of work, to start the foundation. So even though we didn't initially get a positive response in that office, by the end of the conversation, they said, oh, here's something you can do. So we were at the Vice Presidency yesterday. They had this interest in helping poor people, and they're looking for ways of supplementing both government and international donor aid. So I think that there will be a great future for this. It just means we need to educate people, we need to bring them along, we need to show them how it can be successful, and as I say, we have to have a roadmap. We have to figure out what assets, what kinds of funds we could tap into, and then have a plan for how they could be used, how a governance structure would be set up for a foundation, how it would work, how to avoid the conflict of interest, how to make sure that there are all these controls on the foundation so that the money doesn't disappear, and so on. So this is the beginning of the road, and I expect it will take a little bit of time till we make the progress we want to make, but I'm very happy with the meeting today and what we've been able to accomplish so far.
Thank you very much, Aaron Bonstein, for talking with us. We hope that we should be able to implement the PTP in Nigeria. Thank you once again.
Was the key message that we took from his presentation, zero on the issue of mobilizing domestic resources for development and endowing a foundation. The reason why you hear about Harvard, you hear of MIT, is an endowed fund that has made those universities to be very successful. Today, Nigerian universities are not able to carry out any research because they don't have the fund to do those kind of work. Government alone cannot fund it. Tiered fund is another good thing that we have seen, that because of government allocating just 1%, is it tiered fund? You can see what they are doing in the country. So this is what this endowment fund can do for the civil society. You can imagine if Dangote decided to fund some good governance work in Nigeria. It will be very useful. MTN, it will help complement what Ford Foundation, Osiwa are currently doing in the country. And the reason why we want the civil society to be deeply involved in this debate is that we need a new portfolio of funds. And the earlier we start thinking, developing a new portfolio of funds, the better for the work we do in the country. And in the first place, and one of the things this committee wants to do you know that the value, our contribution to the GDP in this country is not captured in the national statistics? It's not. That is another thing we want to do with the Johns Hopkins University. The value, when you see the GDP, they are categorized. What the private sectors are contributing, what different sectors are contributing. But what civil society is contributing, they are not. If just the employment alone that we are employing, we are contributing to the economy, but it's not captured. So the government sometimes does not even recognize the value that we are bringing on the table. And so nobody talk about funding us. Whereas in countries like Europe, the government create a separate fund to fund what civil society are doing. And the civil society in those countries draw money from such foundation. So there is every reason why we should begin to think in this direction, and then to also demonstrate with evidence that we are contributing a value to the entire process of the country.
I think it's an encouragement, given the face of the National Social Investment Program, which ActionAid and also ANIJ and many other civil society are monitoring. Is our interest to say something should be done for the very poor. And now our state or our country have admitted that more than 100 million are living below the poverty line. And so anything and everything should be done to pull the very poor. Nigeria is blessed with natural and human resources massively, and we have no business being below the poverty line. We believe in it. The issue of corruption, which you mentioned, is something of interest to us. That every facet, even the privatization, if you go through the readings of how most of the assets were privatized, a lot of looting went on there. And so when we are mentioning the East again, for ActionAid Nigeria and also ANIJ, we are working on massive mobilization against corruption across the country right now. So anything that will add more momentum to that aspect, that we have to take our country back. The looting is enough, and we need to take it back. Where we are being blessed, you see a lot of blessings for those who have even looted the country. They bless them with new appointments, which is very sad indeed. And so we will pay attention to that. And the conditional cash transfer. I want to say that, many years ago, as a governance team leader, in ActionAid, we were sent to Brazil to learn the Bolsa Familia. That's the conditional cash transfer. And those were many years ago. And I tried to specify that we learned our lessons and we came back to Nigeria. We shared our, experience with the government, but many people were not interested. It was only the coming of President Muhammadu Buhari, that came in and instituted or had now gone on ahead to establish the National Social Investment Office, which is controlling the National Social Investment Program.
The NRC implements the Natural Resource Charter, which is a global initiative that is implemented across the world by the Natural Resource Governance Institute.
And what the NRC Charter basically is defined 12 precepts. The first is to improve the economic and social well-being of the country using the natural resource.
Well, you've listened to the PTP challenge, or is it the PTP idea that has been brought to Nigeria? Would we take it? Now to other issues. Nigerians are making history all over the world, and Adebayo Alonge, a young Nigerian, just won the Hello Global Challenge 2019. So he's the grand winner and the digital health winner. Why? How? Let's watch this clip as they announce him winner.
The grand winner of Hello Tomorrow 2019 is... RXO from Nigeria!
Thank you so much. It's been a long journey personally for me. From 15 years ago, surviving death from a fake drug, to standing in front of you here and getting you to believe in my dream and in the dream of my co-founders to make sure that people across the world are safe from fake medicines. The history of science, we know, over the last 500, 600 years, with the early innovators that came out from Europe, all of them were focused on using science to improve the world. And we thank them for all the great innovations that we have. The toilet that saved us from sewage and the contamination and diseases. The vaccines from Pasteur here in France that has enabled millions of people across the world to be safe from common viruses and all the bacteria. I, having a science background, it's always been my strong belief, and actually after surviving that trauma, my goal was to use science and the solution we have today to make sure that nobody has to go through the trauma that I experienced anymore. And I appreciate that everybody who is here today buys into that vision of using deep tech to achieve global social impact. We believe that myself and my team, and together with you, that we would be able to use science to create a better world going forward into the far future. Thank you so much.
Wow, so many issues to soak in, business and economic issues. And then you begin to wonder, how do you absorb all these and begin to make them make meaning and impact in your life? Well, that's why we are here. We're global business. We give you the impact. Anyway, join us again next week for another edition. I am Imewo Yomokai. And remember, it's always nice doing business with you.